Future Hindsight. Who are the women powering the right? Welcome to Future Hindsight, where we take big ideas in civic life and democracy and turn them into action items for you and me. Because democracy is not a spectator sport, tomorrow starts right now. I'm Mila Atmos. When we talk about the rise of right-wing politics, we mostly hear about young men and how they are captured by the rhetoric of online influencers, podcasters, and provocateurs, not to mention the actual politicians. But often overlooked are the women who hold a great deal of power within this movement, the organizers and believers and tastemakers, without whom there would be no victory. The women of the right are a powerful force in American politics that have largely flown under the radar. To explore what drives their engagement, we're joined by Dr. Gaddini, who has spent nearly a decade finding out who these women are. Dr. Gaddini is a sociologist, visiting scholar at Stanford University, and the author of Esther's Army, the Christian Women Who Power the American Right. And before we start, if you want to support Future Hindsight and all the work we do as an independent podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's easy and free, and it really goes a long way. Check us out at youtube.com/Future Hindsight. Welcome, Katie. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You started the work on this book 9 years ago, so around 2016, 2017. I'm curious about what you saw at that time that prompted you to start this project. What was your hypothesis going in, and what's the state of that hypothesis today?
So I started this research right after Trump was named the Republican nominee in 2016. I was living in London, and I thought, this is an amazing opportunity for a political sociologist. So I flew back to California, where I'm from, and I did a handful of interviews with women who were Christian and asked them who they planned to vote for in the election. And all but one planned to vote for Trump. And the reasons they gave, they liked his immigration policies, especially about keeping Latin Americans and Muslims out of the country. And they felt, moreover, that their pastors and Christian communities were advocating for Trump as the president. I flew back to the UK and, like so many others, didn't necessarily think Trump would win. And when he did, I thought I have to carry on with this research, especially when I found out that 81% of white evangelicals voted for him. And a large percentage of those were women. So that was really how the project started. I didn't go in with a hypothesis. I went in with a genuine curiosity, maybe we could even say bafflement, on how women, Christian women, could vote for this candidate whose behavior seemed very un-Christian and not very friendly toward women. And that curiosity is what drove the 9 years of research.
Right. Well, a lot of people find Christian white women, or any Christian woman, whatever her race may be, who are Trump voters, to be genuinely difficult to understand. It's really a mystery, a puzzle for people like myself. So your book is really comprehensive at overturning, all the stones that you could overturn, frankly. But underneath the apparent contradictions, how would you describe the shared belief that seems to bind the right-wing Christian women's movement together and makes it coherent from the inside so they can vote for someone like Trump?
Well, they feel first and foremost under attack. This has been a long-standing narrative within white evangelicalism in the U.S., and it's really been activated since the pandemic and since Trump first took office in 2016. They feel as Christians that they are under attack by the left, by what they call woke ideology or political correctness, by Democrats, and they want to reclaim the country. They want to save it. They want to save the nation's children. And this is an animating feature across the different types of right-wing Christian women that I look at, is this idea of we are being persecuted and we need to fight back and we also need to save the nation. And indeed, we see this rhetoric a lot with Donald Trump himself. This has been a pillar of his role in public life since 2016. So that is one factor. Now, the women that I profile in the book really differ in terms of the issues that they care about and how they speak about those issues. But there are common threads. So there's a real opposition at the moment to trans rights, for example. And this came to the fore after the pandemic, when mothers in particular became politically activated against mask mandates, social distancing mandates, and vaccines. And then now it has taken its shape onto trans rights, especially when it comes to trans youth. So that's one issue that cuts across. Immigration's another issue that cuts across, as I mentioned. And also the economy. And this is something that I think is often missing from news headlines, is how much right-wing Christian women care about the economy too. They may frame it in language that is gendered and that is particular to their vision of the good life, but that is another major concern that cuts across the different groups I look at.
Well, you just mentioned that they feel under attack, and your book is titled Esther's Army. It would be really helpful for the listener to explain why you chose that title. Many conservative women reach for the story of Esther in the Old Testament, the queen who risks everything to save her people. Tell us her story and why it resonates so powerfully today. Like, what does it tell us about how right-wing women understand their own role in public life and in the political arena specifically?
So Esther was a queen in the Old Testament. There's a book of the Bible named after her, and she was called by God to save the Jews from destruction. She was a Jewish queen. She hid the fact that she was Jewish. And then at the last minute, she risked everything and pled with her husband, the king, to save the Jews. And he did save them, and she was spared as well and became the victor in the story. And modern day right-wing Christian women draw on that story. They see themselves as modern day Esthers. And that tells us a few things about their politics. So one, it says that they see the role of women in politics as being a very important one. They don't see women as being in the shadows anymore. They think women should be front and center, should be the heroines of the drama that's unfolding in the country. And two, they see that there is an attack going on. There is a sense of destruction, impending doom, and that they are the ones, again, to save this doom from being carried out. But what I realized as the research went on is that there's another element too, and that is an element of violence and high stakes. So one of the vignettes I tell in the story is being at this huge rally at the National Mall a few weeks before the 2024 election. There were 250,000 women there, and many called themselves modern-day Esthers. They would wear necklaces that said Esther on it. They invoked verses of the Bible from the book of Esther. And at the end of the day, they rolled granite slabs onto the stage, and they took sledgehammers and they tried to destroy what they called an Old Testament idol. And this brought to mind to me the level of violence, whether it's rhetorical violence or physical violence or symbolics, taking sledgehammers and destroying something and cheering on the other women that were doing the activity. There's a level of the stakes are high and we'll stop at nothing to achieve our goal. And indeed, they quote a verse from Esther that says, "If I perish, I perish." And that really resonated with me to show me how important they see their task in this moment and how scared they are of losing America.
I have to say, when I read that chapter on Mama Bears, which is where you describe the scene at the end of the chapter, I was really startled. I was like, whoa, what? Like, I had no idea that this happened, that people felt so passionately. I was genuinely surprised overall by the level of activism and enthusiasm for political engagement among the women in the book. And I feel like we need to dig a little deeper here, because since Nixon, we have a perception that the right is the quote-unquote silent majority, but clearly there's no doubt they are not silent anymore. And you quote a woman who said that conservative women were red-pilled in 2020. And you yourself actually say that 2020 was a watershed moment for right-wing women to get engaged. On the left, people are always encouraging each other to get more engaged, and there is no such problem on the right. Tell us more.
I think as scholars, especially scholars of politics, we have a short-term memory when it comes to the pandemic. There's a sense of not taking the pandemic as seriously as we should and understanding the contemporary political moment. The benefit of doing long-term qualitative research is that I was able to observe these women's political engagement before a huge event like the pandemic and then after. And when I did field work around 2020, 2021, I saw that women were politically engaged in a way they hadn't been before. Several women told me they were awakened. They talked about being red-pilled. They talked about their eyes being opened, being activated. These were all words that they used. And that was because they lost trust in mainstream institutions, the media, health authorities, and because of the mandates that came with the coronavirus. So when I then was picking up the fieldwork in 2023, 2024, I thought, what's going to happen to that awakening? Are women going to go back to how they were before the pandemic? What's their political engagement going to look like now? And to my surprise, they are not going back. And in fact, one woman told me, I can't go back. There's no going back. My eyes are open and I'm in the game now. And so what I've seen over the long research that I've done is that the pandemic was a watershed moment in terms of energizing women, but also in terms of their political engagement getting dialed up a notch, becoming engaged in ways they hadn't before, and that they're not going back to that sort of pre-political self. And I think as scholars, we need to take the pandemic, we need to analyze it a little bit more in the present moment and see its effects and how they're playing out. Because in my own research, I've seen it was a huge moment. There's a before and there's an after.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's just shocking. I mean, honestly, I felt like reading your book, like the scales fell off my eyes. I had no idea. I thought, oh, wait, we're misunderstanding this entirely. And we're talking about all the wrong things.
That's exactly what I want to hear. So that's the perfect.
I'm glad. But it's the kind of thing where, when you talk to people, they're always like, well, how can we reach them to change their minds? And I always think, no, you're not going to reach them to change their minds. Just like you're not going to reach somebody who's a Bernie supporter, to change their mind about economic populism. You will also not do that here. But I am curious now about the shifting role of feminism within the movement. The right-wing woman has evolved since the 1970s from the era of Phyllis Schlafly, who is the face of the defeat of the Equal Rights Amendment and her rejection of feminism as something that removes women from their traditional role. And you argue there's a kind of rebranding today that attaches feminist language to causes like, as you mentioned earlier, restricting immigration and limiting transgender rights. How did that turn happen in your mind? And how can we make sense of how the women's liberation movement is repurposed in this way?
That was one of the surprising findings of my research, because when we look at powerhouse right-wing women from the 70s and 80s, and indeed we think of Phyllis Schlafly, their whole political aim was to destroy feminism. They were anti-feminists. They took their ire and feminism out on the Equal Rights Amendment. They had no sort of conflicted relationship with feminism, and those were their foes. And there's some famous debates between Phyllis Schlafly and Betty Friedan that exemplifies the two positions. At the same time, there were conservative feminists within the Republican Party. That was something that I learned more about going back into the archives. And they were essentially pushed out of the party when the Christian right and the likes of Phyllis Schlafly took over, especially in the 80s. So we had a period of sort of lulling or cooling with conservatism and feminism. And then what I observed now is that there are quite a few conservative women, MAGA women, in fact, who call themselves feminist, or who maybe don't call themselves a feminist, but are very friendly towards feminism. They might try to argue, for example, that opposing abortion is a feminist issue, or opposing trans rights is a feminist issue. There's a whole host of issues that they would attach feminism to. And this was surprising for me, because this is a massive shift from the past, from the way that right-wing women organized and spoke about feminism. And I also found amongst different groups of women that the relationship with feminism is different. So some of the Gen Z women I met would not call themselves feminists, but they speak with a lot of liberal feminist language about having it all, or women's empowerment, or go girl, that kind of form of feminism. And then women that are more high profile, we can think of Representative Nancy Mace. She has really been friendly towards feminism. Anna Paulina Luna has also made very positive remarks about feminism, and they are, pretty visible MAGA representatives. So there's an interesting change that is taking place. And I think it raises questions for those of us who are on the left and consider ourselves feminist of what does feminist mean and who can lay claim to it? And is it just the preserve of the left? Can people on the right also call themselves feminists? Can they claim certain issues that have historically been very united with the left, such as abortion and reproductive rights, or opposing them? It throws up a lot of interesting questions, I think, about feminism, the state of feminism in the country currently.
Well, so one of the overriding questions I had in the book is, listen, being a feminist in like a very basic sense to me means that you're allowed to do whatever a man might do with his power, his thoughts, his position. And who's to say that any woman can do it this way or that way? Isn't this in a way feminism working the way that it's designed? I don't know really what the answer is, but I thought to myself, I don't think that it's, quote, wrong necessarily.
Yeah, and I think it also makes us reexamine the definition of feminism. So I tell a story in the book about when I was at Liberty University, which is the largest conservative Christian college in the country. One of the women that I had interviewed a few times took me out to lunch, and she sat me down and she said, there's something I need to talk to you about. And I had this sinking feeling of, oh my God, what has she found online? And she said, me and some of the other girls were online yesterday, and we came across information that you are a feminist. And we just thought, that does not sound like Katie. How can you be a feminist? And it was a really illuminating moment because it allowed me to ask her, well, what is your definition of feminism? And she said, feminism is that you hate men. And we had this really productive back and forth about what does feminism mean? What does it mean to me? What is her understanding of it? Where did she get those ideas about it? So I think that is in flux right now. I think feminism is under sort of contestation, construction, and the fact that it is being, you can choose your word, borrowed, repurposed, appropriated, used by women on the right really should cause all of us to reconsider what feminism means and what definition we're holding to.
Right. Yeah, that's well said. Let's talk about power. A lot of these women, especially people who went to Liberty University or influencers online, actually, even though they're, quote, influencers online, but they're often cast as followers. They are followers of Trump or they're followers of MAGA. But you found among these women organizers, donors, strategists, and, like I mentioned, influencers. So I want to know about how much real political power these women wield and how they do that inside a party and a country where formal leadership still skews heavily male. What does their influence in your mind tell us about how power works in American politics?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So on the one hand, we have more women in leadership roles in the Trump administration than is average for a Republican administration. So that's less than a Democrat administration, certainly less than the Biden administration. But it is on the heavier side when it comes to Republicans. And this has caused some women that I met to say that Trump is a very pro-woman president, that he advocates and supports women because he appointed women to public-facing leadership roles in his cabinet, chief of staff, press secretary, etc. But I want to think about power outside of the classic understanding of being in a role or being elected to office, because there's certainly examples of right-wing women in those roles. And one area which allows us to think about power more expansively is when it comes to social media and the social media influencer ecosystem that has grown on the right. over the last decade. And these women don't hold office, they weren't elected, they may not have even the salaries that would reflect power in the conventional sense. And yet what they are saying about issues and the country and culture is having a tremendous impact on the women that follow them. And I was able to observe and analyze these influencers by doing social media analysis. And then I was also able to interview women on the ground and ask them, how are you receiving this information? Where do you get your news? What are you learning from this influencer? How is that impacting your day to day? And that's where I saw the sort of expansiveness of power and political power and how the online right-wing ecosystem has opened up new avenues of power, especially for women, that previously or historically have not been open to them.
Yeah. Well, if you believe that culture is upstream from politics, then the social media ecosystem on the right is like, exhibit A, so to speak. And, they do that so well, folding politics into parenting content, health tips, fashion, and of course, entertainment. They've been so effective at influencing everyday lifestyle feeds to become political vehicles, and shaping what people believe and who they trust. How do you think about how they have been so effective at this? Like, how are they so successful?
Well, on the one hand, it's been very strategic. So there's no sort of accident that this has happened. And Charlie Kirk, when he was alive, was very clear about the fact that Turning Point had recruited and trained and pumped millions of dollars into influencers ahead of the 2024 election. That was one of the strategies of Turning Point USA. And indeed, there's other conservative leaders and media conglomerates that have been very strategic and very determined to create a right-wing online world that will sway politics. And they do follow the Breitbart doctrine of politics is downstream from culture. So there's been a lot of money behind it. There's been a lot of strategy behind it. And then on the other hand, if we look back historically, the right has had a certain dominance on the media over the left. So talk radio is a great example. When Rush Limbaugh came on the airwaves in the early 80s, he was hugely popular. And Beverly LaHaye also had multiple radio stations going at the same time where she would talk about culture or motherhood or Christian living, but then she would weave in politics. So there has a history in the United States of the right using the media in a really politically savvy way over the left. And they've sort of outfoxed the left when it comes to media. And that's certainly the case in the present day.
We'll be back with Katie in just a moment, so stick around. You'll have to hear this episode's Civic Spark, one small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. But first, when I first started Future Hindsight all those years ago, every day seemed to introduce another question that needed an answer, and doing it all on my own was overwhelming. I'm sure you can relate. When your to-do list just grows and grows with new tasks every day, it can pretty easily start to take over your life if you're not careful. But what if you could find the right tool that not only helps you out, but simplifies everything? Sounds like a game changer, right? For millions of businesses out there, that tool is Shopify. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world and 10% of all e-commerce in the United States. From household names like Thrive Cosmetics to fresh brands that are just getting started. And Shopify is there for you too. You can get the word out as if you have a marketing team behind you. Easily create email and social media campaigns wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling. Now, you might be wondering, what if people haven't heard about my brand? It's okay. Shopify helps you find your customers with easy-to-run email and social media campaigns. So tackle all those important tasks in one place, from inventory to payments to analytics and more. No need to save multiple websites or try to figure out what platform is hosting the tool that you need. Everything is all in one spot, making your life easier and your business operations smoother. What I love about Shopify is how no matter how big you want to grow, Shopify gives you everything you need to take control and take your business to the next level. It's time to turn those what-ifs into cha-ching with Shopify today. Sign up for your $1 per month trial today at shopify.com/hopeful. Go to shopify.com/hopeful. That's shopify.com/hopeful. And now let's return to my conversation with Katie Gaddini. Along the lines still of culture being upstream from politics, and we touched on this briefly at the top of the conversation, tell us a little bit more about what counts as a women's issue on the right. We can agree that both the left and the right claim to speak for women, whether that's on abortion or schools, having a career, etc. And of course, economic issues. I mean, you mentioned that right-wing women are interested in economics, and I would say definitely left-wing women are interested in economic populism and very interested in economics. So aside from something obvious like reproductive freedom, what are the issues that really animate them?
So certainly parental authority or maternal authority has become a lightning rod issue for right-wing women over the last 6 years since the pandemic. And the way that it takes the shape now is women are trying to infiltrate school boards, either to be a school board leader or president, or just to attend some of the hearings to influence decisions that are made on a local level or a state level. It can, go all the way up from local and community all the way to state or federal level. But that's become a major target, is they want to influence education. They want to make sure that there's no gender and sexual diversity in the curriculum or in the literature that is in the school library or indeed the county or regional library. Critical race theory was a huge issue. I'm seeing it less so now as a target. And, of course, anything to do with health, so vaccine mandates or any sort of requirements that come to health or vaccines is another issue that they're going to target. So that has been a major one. And school choice, of course, and what I mean by school choice is, for my interlocutors, is they want to be able to homeschool their children or send them to a private Christian school and have federal dollars follow the child to that private school and help subsidize the cost because they're not utilizing the public school system. And again, this is one of those cases where there's been a really long history in the United States of mothers on both sides of the aisle politicking as mothers when it comes to their children and when it comes to education. And we can look as far back as the 60s when right-wing women were protesting busing and desegregation. And there's changes, of course, but the same thread applies to the present day, where they want to have ultimate authority over their children in the educational setting.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that. I actually have to admit here that wanting to dismantle the Department of Education was always a little bit of a mystery to me. I never fully understood where that came from or what the underlying goal was. And now, having read your book, I was like, oh, I get it. That's why.
Yeah.
And so now it makes perfect sense. But I used to be like, but don't they still want their children to learn how to read and write? That's not what this is about. So I have a question about trad wives. It's a little bit of a pivot here. You found that only one woman you interviewed follows a trad wife, which surprised you. Frankly, it surprised me too. So what are trad wives really about? Why do they loom so large in the public imagination without being the mainstream model for conservative women? And who do these conservative women actually look up to instead?
Yeah, so this is one of those questions I get asked every time I speak to a journalist. Every public event I do, somebody's asking me about trad wives. I was just in London and thought, okay, they're not going to ask about it here because it's not as big of a thing as in the US. And I was wrong, of course. I was asked the same question. And so I've checked with scholars, especially experts who work in the media studies, and those who work in more specifically on U.S. politics, and asked them, am I missing something here? Because my research did not show that trad wives are having as big of an impact or an influence as the cultural fascination and media fascination would have us believe. And I'm reassured in checking with my colleagues that indeed, it doesn't seem to be playing out on the everyday political level on the right in the same way that one would be led to believe if we were just reading the media. So I think a few things are happening here. we talked about the vast conservative ecosystem. There are influencers for every emotional valence or interest or age group or region that you could ever want as a conservative. So it's a very vast system. And a lot of the influencers that the women I met look up to are women like Allie Beth Stuckey or Alex Clark, Candace Owens, though she's fallen out of favor with some, Erica Kirk. Those are the women they're looking to for advice, for Christian living, but also for political guidance. They're not looking to tradwives for that. Maybe they follow a tradwife because they like the aesthetics or they find it fascinating and almost kind of like a car crash in the way that some on the left also see it. But they're not getting guidance. They're not getting daily living advice. They're not getting political impact from those tradwives. So I think we have to really separate out what the influencer is doing and what the user is looking to them to get. And then there's also a level of the aesthetic being really attractive, the imagery being attractive or being interesting or catching the eye. But that doesn't necessarily translate to political impact. Now, I have to caution this because a colleague did point out to me that the tradwives are still perpetuating an idea of a heterosexual marriage, a lot of children, and traditional gender roles, which can be quite damaging being glorified in the way that it is. So it's not that tradwives aren't doing any work online. It's just they're not doing the political work that maybe we attribute them to.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like churning butter will not turn out the vote.
Exactly. That's a very good way to look at it. And I have to say as well, I asked about 4,000 women in this Facebook group of conservative women that I was part of for a few years. I asked them, who do you look to get news? Who do you even follow online? And that was a question I asked every interviewee. And none of them mentioned a tradwife. So I'm just going based off of what my research has said to me. I know there's a lot of really good research coming out on tradwives. But again, I'm not sure how much tradwives are mobilizing or energizing the MAGA movement.
The face of conservatism in the United States is definitely changing, and maybe tradwives are just a much smaller part of it than is being covered in the New York Times. You dedicate a whole chapter on Blexit. Black exit. And you frame that as a phenomenon where faith supersedes race and Christianity serving as a uniting force for conservative Black women to realign or to align with the changing face of conservatism in America. Tell us about what you think this is doing to the movement.
So we have to look at changes that are happening within Black Christianity in the United States. And there's been some really good work done on this by Jason Shelton and Jamar Tisby and Eric McDaniel, just to name a few. And they are charting how Black Christianity is crumbling, reorganizing, and a lot of Black Christians are going to non-denominational churches, either Black majority churches or multiracial churches. And that's also shifting a lot of Black Christians' politics. And we saw that in 2024, there were much higher numbers of Black men voting for Trump than the previous two elections. And there's been a lot written about that. But 10% of Black women voted for Trump. And yes, that's a low number. You can look at that and say that doesn't mean much. But when you look historically, it had been decades since that many Black women had turned out for a Republican candidate. And this is when a mixed race woman was running on the left who very much leaned on her history of going to a historically Black college, of having ties with the Black community. And Black women still voted for Trump, who has a history, again, of racially insensitive policies and rhetoric. So there's something puzzling going on there. And that was one of the questions driving that chapter of my book is why would 10% of Black women turn out for this candidate in 2024? And I found that indeed a lot of them employ what I call a race-conscious perspective on their view of politics, which means that they see being a Black woman as compatible with being a supporter of Trump. And then some take a colorblind approach, which is they don't think their race matters when it comes to voting for Trump. They are a Christian first and foremost, and their Christian faith leads them to Trump as a candidate. And women took different approaches, and I chart both of those in the history of those within U.S. politics and try to show that were reasons driving women to vote for Trump, and also the way that they understood themselves as women, as Black women, and as Christian women.
Right. Well, I want to turn here to what you think is going to endure. You write that despite the recent cracks, these women's commitment to MAGA will outlast Trump and will likely outlive even the women who are in the movement today. And like you said, these women said there's no turning back. Like, they're not going back to the way things were. What do you think is going to give, or is already giving, this movement that staying power? You know, a movement that is built to outlive its own figurehead.
The movement's been tremendously successful at building a coalition, so bringing in voters who are historically not aligned to the Republican Party, such as Black women, for example, such as Latinos, such as earthy, crunchy, hippie moms who maybe are opposed to most of the tenets of the GOP, but who are sympathetic to the MAHA, or Make America Healthy Again movement. And so they are an sort of outside, strange bedfellow with MAGA. So, the coalition itself being so broad is both a strength, but also a potential risk, because there's many points of fracture with so many people being brought together under the same MAGA umbrella that previously haven't been political allies with one another. I'm not sure even how much Trump has to do with it at this moment in time, meaning even though most of the women that I interviewed still really like Trump, they think he's a great president, the movement has superseded him in a way. There's this core set of tenets and principles that exist outside of Trump. So principles such as parental authority over education, or wanting to ban food dyes and be more selective about what vaccines are required for children. Those core tenets that have been articulated by the MAGA movement are going to endure beyond Trump's presidency. And that's why I say the MAGA movement will likely outlive him.
Well, so if there's one thing you want listeners to take away about the women who power the American right and the beliefs that are undergirding their engagement, what would that be in terms of the future of American democracy?
I would say don't underestimate these women. They are not simply voting the way their husbands tell them or the way that their fathers tell them. They, in many cases, have political ambitions outside of their spouse. The younger women that I met have ambitions to a career in politics. They are being trained as we speak to become the next political leaders of our country. They're being supported. They're being funded. So don't underestimate right-wing women now or in the future.
Well said. So we are a civic engagement show, and we always want to inspire our audience to take civic action. So every week on Future Hindsight, I ask my guest to share a civic spark, one small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. What's a good way to turn the insights that you've shared with us into action?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think on the one hand, it's to stay engaged. And I know that other guests on your podcast have already said that, but I'll say it again because I think it's an important one. I think as we enter midterm season, and a lot of us are feeling drained by U.S. politics, we're feeling overwhelmed by it. We don't want to tune in. We don't want another election season. And yet it's still really important to stay engaged, to know about the issues on your ballot, to research them, to take part in local elections. We just had one where I live that was hugely successful. And it was because there was a group of people, mostly women, who refused to disengage from politics. And they continued to care, even though it's tiresome, even though in many cases they're facing an uphill battle. So as we enter midterm season, try to stay engaged, try to care, even if it feels hard. Get out and vote, research topics, talk to your neighbors, and try to keep those lines of communication open as well with people around you.
Yeah, hear, hear. Last question. Looking into the future, what makes you hopeful?
I'm really inspired by Christian leaders in this country who are embracing a politics of inclusion empathy, kindness, that are really getting back to the teachings of Jesus that are presented in the Bible. The famous one, of course, is the Texas candidate James Tallarico. But there's other Christian leaders who are not running for office, such as Reverend Angela Denker, who are speaking out against Christian nationalism and the way the Christian faith has been weaponized and misused by the MAGA movement. And they are providing a corrective to that understanding. And they fill me with so much hope that this country has a brighter future ahead of it. And that Christianity also isn't going to just be a vehicle for punishment and exclusion and those sorts of efforts.
Yeah. Well, I hope that this will all come to pass, that Christianity will cease to be weaponized and instead be a light for all of us in this country. Katie, thank you so much for joining me on Future Hindsight. It was really a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you. It was really great to be here.
Dr. Katie Gaddini is a sociologist, visiting scholar at Stanford University, and the author of Esther's Army, The Christian Women Who Power the American Right. Remember, civic action doesn't have to be complicated. It's about small steps that spark progress, like sharing this episode with a friend. Let's recap this week's Civic Spark and fire up our collective power. As we approach the midterm season this election year, make sure you stay in a civically engaged mindset. It's way too easy to get discouraged or even distracted by the multiple crises we're facing. So make a conscious effort to be informed, wield your power, and stay engaged. Next week on Future Hindsight, we'll be joined by Alex Hurdle Fernandez. He's the Herbert H. Lehman Professor of Government at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs.
When I think about democracy, I really take a much broader perspective, and one that I think is resonant with many other thinkers throughout American history. And that thinks about democracy not just at the ballot box, but across our economy, and says we can't have a true democracy if we have unequal distributions of power in our economy.
That's next time on Future Hindsight. Now, be sure to follow us on your podcast app so you'll never miss an episode. And while you're there, please leave us a review. It really goes a long way for Future Hindsight to be discovered by other listeners. And if you're listening on your browser, you can find Future Hindsight on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcast app. We're here to build your civic action toolkit every week, so follow Future Hindsight now and we'll come right to you. And if you can't get enough of Future Hindsight, consider subscribing to the Civics Club on Patreon. You'll get early access to episodes every week, and it's a great way to support the show and all the work that we do as an independent, pro-democracy podcast. Head to patreon.com/Future Hindsight. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, see clearly, act boldly, and spark the change you want to see. This episode was produced by Zack Travis and me.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.